good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Christ is risen. It gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Bissera Pentcheva, whose innovative work in acoustics, art and music has redefined the area of Byzantine architecture and also more recently Western medieval art. She's published 3 books which have all won prizes: Icons and Power, The Mother of God in Byzantium; The Sensual Icon, Space, Ritual and the Senses in Byzantium; and Hagia Sophia, Sound, Space and Spirit in Byzantium. And she's also edited 2 other volumes related to oral architecture, music, acoustics, ritual, and Icons of Sound, Architecture, Music and Imagination in Medieval Art, which I believe is her most recent volume. Her work is interdisciplinary, moving between anthropology, music and phenomenology, and drawing attention to the changing appearance of objects and architectural spaces. One concrete oral result of her work has been her collaboration with Cappella Romana and their work with the acoustical space of the great church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So Bissera, I will give you the floor, and thank you so much for attending the conference and for giving this talk. Welcome.
Thank you, Father Moody, and also I am grateful to Father Damaskinos for this invitation. It is a pleasure to present here at this forum, and I also would like to extend thanks to my colleagues and friends who have been very gracious to field many questions in the past couple of months as I was preparing this talk, and especially Alexander Loukas, Christian Trausgaard, and Ioannis Arvanitis. There are many others as well, but these 3 really have been incredible supporters. So I start here. Hagia Sophia, and I must say that the title of the talk is changed, and it's Eternal Victory, Byzantine Territorial Expansion and Constantinopolitan Liturgical Splendor at Hosios Loukas in Greece. Hagia Sophia, overpowered with its unprecedented and unimitable scale of a dome raised over 56 meters above the floor and a diameter over 32 meters and an interior volume of over 255,000 cubic meters. It could contain up to 16,000 people, and it mesmerized all with its gold mosaics, marble revetments, and floor of natural light pouring from its glassified walls. The Kiev Rus ambassador's words capture this magnetic power of the great church as recorded in 987, and I quote, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we were at a loss how to describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of other nations. For we cannot forget that beauty." End of quote. Entering the Kalichoros of Hagia Sophia and participating in its liturgy uplifted the faithful to the divine. They were ephemerally in a metaxou, a space in between heaven and earth. New poetry and new music continued to be composed for Hagia Sophia, and some of the authors were the emperors themselves, like Leo VI in the late 9th, early 10th century. I will play for you his Ticheron for the Feast of the Elevation of the Cross. It is written in the 2nd mode, final E. Watch how, at special words like Silon, the melody climbs to a D, 1 below the final, and then at Vasilistis Doxis, it climaxes at the final E. Then a melisma introduces how this power, metaphysical power, affects us, Hemas, the Byzantines. And here it's the long melisma on Hemas. You hear well. This is Capella Romana singing the Sticheron, and it is part of the Lost Voices of Hagia Sophia. You can listen to them. The album is available, and there are many online sources from which you can find it. So these hymns are hymns of glory and power as the Macedonian dynasty successfully sustained the momentum, reclaiming its territories in Syria and Palestine. 961, reconquest of Crete, which freed the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean from Arab pirates. 969, reconquest of Antioch. 972 to 975, entry of the armies of Tsimiskis into Syria, the capture of Sidon, Byblos, Homs, and the entry into North Palestine. Art bears some of the traces of this period of triumph in the second half of the 10th century. The Joshua roll, capturing the confidence of the 10th century generals and emperors, fulfilling the promise of the Old Testament, incarnating the Byzantine advance and recuperation of the Promised Land. Or the cross at Limburg, with its inscription, God stretched out his hands upon the wood of the cross, gushing forth through it the energies of life. Constantine and Romanos, the emperors, with a frame of radiant stones and pearls, have displayed it full of wonder. Upon it, Christ formally smashed the gates of hell, giving new life to the dead, and the crowned ones, who have now adorned it, crush slaughtering the barbarians. The powerful words at the end, crush slaughtering, articulate the confidence of the Byzantine emperors in the mid-10th century and the might of the Christian empire to come back triumphant. While Hagia Sophia gave a great stage to enact the eternal triumph, the interior never managed to pull figural decoration into the core of the celebration. The Justinianic Church lacked anthropomorphic figuration, and when Photius in 867 began after iconoclasm to fill the interior with images of Christ, the Virgin, and saints, these were always too diminutive in the breathtaking scale of this architectural interior. These figural mosaics are like specks on the wall, as you see here the mosaic of the Virgin and Child. The main surface of the Kalichoros, the space under the dome, did not have narrative images. The latter were relegated to the domical vaults of the aisles, as you see here in the southern gallery of Pentecost. In Hagia Sophia, the main medium of the metaphysical remained light and reverberant sound. As other churches, but in other churches, with their delicate and smaller scale, these were the Palatine chapels and aristocratic foundations. It is here that a new image program, filling these interiors with scenes of the life of Christ, emerged after iconoclasm. The traces of this Constantinopolitan splendor have not survived the Ottoman conquest, and they have taken a heavy toll with the advance of time. The Church of the Theotokos, Tulibu, founded in 907, is a case in point. Its architecture significantly compresses the monumental scale of Hagia Sophia to produce a brilliant and light-infused and reverberant Kalichoros. It had elegant columns, and this is the Northern Church from 907, elegant columns which no longer survive, lace-like delicate carved cornices, which you can see here in the small details that survive. And gold mosaics, all of which gone. You can taste the exquisiteness of the architectural fabric in the traces surviving on the exterior, where the corbels, blind arches, thin columns, and brick designs articulate precision and aesthetic sensitivity to pikilia, adorning every square inch of this surface without crowding or excess. The overall impression is that of a man-made calopisma and entrifima, decor and delight, that is the finest expression of the human work, reflecting the unsurpassable beauty of God's creation and thus praising the demiurge. Such churches as the Theotokos to Livu, or the Pharos in the palace, or the Nea Ecclesia were decorated with figural mosaic decorations. To understand the overall impression of such interiors, we need to look outside Constantinople into the extant examples of Hosios Loukas, Neamuni, and Daphne. Here we see how the Kalichoros was organized for the Middle Byzantine Constantinopolitan liturgy. My talk today focuses on Hosios Loukas and explores both the dynamics of its mosaic program and its synergy with the Constantinopolitan liturgy. The monastery of Hosios Loukas is situated in the mountains near Delphi. The land is covered in snow in the winter and comes to life in the spring. It is relatively close to the sea, the Gulf of Corinth, and thus profited from the wiping out of piracy as a result of the Byzantine conquest of Crete in 961. At its shores passed the maritime pilgrimage and trade routes connecting Rome through Athens with Constantinople and Jerusalem. And here is the church. The date and patronage that enabled the magnificent architecture and mosaic decoration is still clouded in mystery, in some mystery. It is tempting to project an imperial investment, given the splendor of its mosaics and the example of the 11th century Neamuni, but no direct evidence supports such a position. Instead, what I could show is that Hosios Loukas emerged as a site developed by powerful Byzantine strategy and a Catepano of Italy, and for these patrons, some of whom became early abbots of the site, the idea of military victory and the opulent ceremonies of Constantinople served as a model emulated at the new foundation. So Hosios Loukas became an esoptron mirror reflecting Constantinople. The saint was born in the early 10th century and died in 953. His feast falls on February 7th, and he has almost immediately been integrated into the Metaphrastion Synaxarion, which speaks to his and his followers' good connections in the Constantinopolitan network. So thus, Hosios Loukas entered the liturgical calendar, but as a newcomer, he did not get the miniature and the Menologion of Basil II, where the established saint, Saint Parthenius, the Episcopus of Lampsicus, has the miniature in this late 10th, early 11th century document. Hosios Loukas excelled in ascesis. He did not eat from early childhood any cheese or even fruit, and subsisted mostly on water, vegetables, and some bread. He acquired fame with his prayer, which allowed him to levitate a couple of centimeters from the ground, also healings and prophecies. But equally famous was the efficacy of his mother's prayer, when he left her without telling her to join a monastic community outside Athens. With her prayers, she managed to bend Christ on her side and requested the return of her son. Hosios Loukas returned home and remained with his mother until her death. Now, let us focus on a little bit on the patronage of the site and what we know. And some of the evidence comes from the crypt that is in the second quarter of the 11th century. And I'm showing you a couple of images. Philoteos, who is one of the abbots of the site, Higumenus, here, and he is represented here in the fresco ceiling. And a piece from the liturgy for May 3rd, the day on which the completion of Hosios Loukas, the new Catholicon, is celebrated. Now, What do we know about this, about the construction? That already at the time of Hosios Loukas, the Strategos of Hellas, Krinitsis, built a church. This church is expanded after the death of Hosios Loukas, and it becomes the northern church of the site. But then in 1011, a new church rise is completed at the site. This is the southern church that is all with the mosaics. This you can see at the upper level, the marble revetments and the mosaics, and here is the crypt. And then we have Philotheos, who says the following in the service. This is from Ode 6 of the canon for the feast of May 3rd, the Anakomidi, which is the transference of the relics of the saint from his original oratory into this new church, into the northern arm of this church. And it says the following: you made yourself Holy Church of the Trinity and the Panagia, O Loukas, O blessed Philotheos, who is the current abbot, transferred you augustly to the new Catholicon, which he raised in your honor piously. Now you amaze the ones who translated your relics in this overwhelming, in large-scale nows, as you appear shiftingly vibrant pikilos, resplendent in gold and silver, like a flower color of light. You emerge as the one channeling the divine, the power of Christ. So the text gives us a sense that both the Catholicon and the mosaics were finished at the same time. And I could come back to this because this is actually a new discovery. Up to this point, the scholars have thought of a separation between the church and the mosaic. The second thing that is important is who paid for the mosaics, that are really a big endeavor. And what we know is the following. There is another abbot, Theodosius, also represented in the crypt, and we have his funerary stele that has survived at the site. And the inscription reads as following: God endowed me with many appellations, those coming from ancestry as well as those coming from the emperors. But I strive to attain salvation. The names, as I did that, the names changed as follows. Theodore became Theodosius. The untouchable Antipatus himself became a monk. The Patricius shrank to a spiritual father. The Catepano submitted to the haughty. The Vestes became a mystic in hairy garb. He did not take with him any part of his fortune, except for his coffin that covers the dead. This is the only earthly gain. End of quote. Already in the first line, Theodore Theodosius states that he has an aristocratic ancestry, kleos, coming from his birth. And he is decorated with titles and offices bestowed on him by the emperors. Observe the plural. The plural already identifies the time of Basil II and Constantine VIII. Theodore Theodosius then proceeds to enumerate his offices and titles, Antipatus, Patricius, Catepano, and Vestes, and how he has casted all of them off for the monastic habit. Furthermore, Theodore, as an ex-Catepano, might have been a direct channel enabling the immediate spread of the cult of Hosios Loukas into Apulia, where we have it in the scroll, exalted scroll of Bari. Who are these Catepani and Strategi, and how did their wealth arose? At the time of the 955 rebuilding of the Northern Church, we have a fresco that survives from its southwest corner, and it represents Joshua with a specific text, "Are you one of us or of the enemies?" And this image was eventually covered with the construction of the new church by Theodosius and Philotheos. But the significance of that is that already the old church from the period of 955 to the early 11th century is fully within the Constantinopolitan climate of victory, the Joshua role, and the successes of the Macedonian dynasty. And then the new church rises at the site. So the spirit of victory is there in the new church, in all the cross arms of the naos of the interior. We see the continuation of this pseudo-Kufic inscription, which the generals of the Christian army wear. For instance, here at the ankles or here at the shield, you see the pseudo-Kufic inscription, as well in the presentation of the temple, the inscription that is in the cupola of the ciborium. So, in other words, the site is identified as a site of victory. Despite being one of the most displayed churches of Byzantium, no significant study has been published on its mosaics. It is this lacuna I address, and at the same time, I offer a new methodology for art history that tightly interconnects the images with the liturgy and the poetry. The images at Hosios Loukas, specific selection, annunciation, nativity, presentation into the temple, and baptism, differs from the other contemporary programs. And the most specific, the difference, for instance, from Daphne is the inclusion of this scene, the presentation into the temple. Neamuni has this huge amount of scenes that is focusing on the Passion of Christ. None of the Passion of Christ is represented in the nave of Hosios Loukas. What it leads me to conclude is there is intentionality behind these programs, and they need to be studied specifically, that the selection of scenes is tied to the dedication of the saint. So Hosios Loukas has two feasts, one of his Chimesis on February 7th, which is very close to the Hippapanti, as well as the feast of the prophet Simeon, February 3rd, and this Strategos and the Theodore Stratilatis of February 8th, as well as Theodore Styron of February 17th. So the idea of the presentation of the temple, as well as the military saints, are clustered around February 7th, the feast of the saint. The second feast day is May 3rd, the Anakomidi, the transference of the relics. So what I'm going to focus right now is on the oratory of Hosios Loukas. It is in the north arm of the cross on the ground floor. Here above the marble revetment and above the cornice arises the gold mosaic of Hosios Loukas. He looks directly ahead, where across from him, in the mirroring lunette, arises the Theotokos carrying the Christ child in her arms. She is the Hudigitria type, directing with her free hand the faithful towards the Logos. The lipsona of the saints were deposited in the theke, here in the reconstruction, underneath the lunette of the Theotokos. They were vesseled in a marble ciborium. Holy oil miraculously flowed from the sorus, bringing healing and blessings. A mirroring oratory, a cross in the southern arm here, was dedicated to another healer saint, Pantaleimon, who healed through his medical skills. And there is a clear distinction between the two that is made, the empty hands raised in prayer of Hosios Loukas and the medical saint who holds his scalpel in his hand. This is the north-south axis of the church, but it is intersected on the east-west with the images of the Virgin and Child in the apse and the Pentecost. The enthroned mother is flanked by the Annunciation, which no longer survives, and the birth of Christ, communicating the emptying of the Logos in the finite and mortal. Christ's presence on the lap of Mary is the image that makes the faithful experience what the Magi intuited in their encounter with the Christ child, recognizing his divine powers. Moreover, by pairing the Theotokos with the Pentecost, a unique choice at Hosios Loukas, the Alpha and the Omega are inscribed, Christ's kenosis in the incarnation and birth, and the release of the Holy Spirit to bridge the time between the ascension and the second coming of Christ. Moreover, the inscription surrounding the image of the mother and child. Just a second. The inscription here comes from Psalm 92, verse 5. To ikusu prepi hagiesma Kyrie, es makrotita imeron. Not only directly evokes the consecrating ceremony, where this passage is recited as part of the ritual of the dressing of the altar, a ceremony that in its core is an inspiriting, similar to the Pentecost. So it's elicited here, this notion of consecration. But the inscription also conjures the Nativity, as it is recited at Vespers, intercalated in the Stichera. The same Psalm 92 is recited also at Vespers for the other feast of the baptism of Christ on January 6th. Thus the two feasts, which are rendered with rays of light in the mosaic. While the light of the star identifies the kenosis of the Logos in a mortal body, at baptism it does the opposite, recognizing the divinity of Christ as the rays synesthetically communicate the voice of the Father identifying his Son. The flow of water becomes the visualization of Psalm 92 in the Theodore Psalter, here showing the miracle at Hone, and the rivers that rise as the pictorialization of the verses 3 and 4. The rivers have lifted up, O Lord, the rivers have lifted up their voices. At the voices of many waters, the billows of the sea are wonderful. The Lord is wonderful in high places. Not only are these lines connected to the divine energy as a powerful gush of water, but they insist on the powerful dynamic of the metaphysical in the resonant voice, like the thundering of vast masses of uncontainable waters. This energy produces miracles. Now the domed interior of Hosios Loukas and its reflective surfaces substantiates this voice to produce long reverberation, thus incarnating in time the voice of many waters, translating synesthetically the flow of water and the light into wet sound, similar, though reduced in scale, to the reverberant acoustics of Hagia Sophia. Moreover, the word quoted, hagiasma, also speaks of pouring, a flow of light and water, and this imaginary flow amplifies with the pairing of the Pentecost. Already the marginal psalters of the mid-9th century envisioned the incarnation as the flow of light and water, dewdrops on a fleece, as shown in Psalm 71, verse 6. He shall come down as rain upon a fleece, and as drops falling upon the earth here. End of quote. The phrase communicates the incarnation as the descent, pouring down of water and light, and the image picks up this idea as blue shafts of light water frame the descent of the Holy Spirit. The incarnation.
I believe you have asked to be informed when there are 5 minutes left. There are 5 minutes left.
Thank you. So a couple more words here. Engestri tis partheno further stratify this notion of incarnation in the body. Outpouring of water, divine might flowing, the thundering voice of many waters, all these metaphors of liquescence of the divine become a powerful mirror for the soros of Hosios Loukas. So these ideas are present in the apse, in the east-west axis, and they become a powerful expression in its intersecting north-south axis with the soros of Hosios Loukas. Here the teki is displayed, and a similar flow of oil, miraculous oil, gushes from it, as Ode 7 of Canon 3 for Othros for February 7 states. And this is in one of the manuscripts, the 11th, 12th century manuscripts of the Liturgy of Meneon, says the following: the theke of your lipsena, Loukas, is a spring of healings in which all who come are freed from all sufferings. This spring enhances your honor, blessed Hosios, and that of your Lord Christ. Paradoxically, the outflow is possible through the opposite, the capacity to vessel in Christ. Hosios Loukas does it kenotically by opening his arms in prayer. Mary, by contrast, has her arms full, carrying the child. Both Hosios Loukas and the Theotokos are called dochia, vessels of the Spirit. And here I will introduce two new ideas: the vesseling of divine as exemplified by Mary and the prophet Simeon, and the specific hodeitria type of the Theotokos that elicits the eternal victory ideology of the Byzantine imperial power. So the chapel, the oratory in the north arm of the cross, the scene of the presentation of the temple with the prophet Simeon and the Virgin, and the Theotokos hodeitria type that is opposite Hosios Loukas in the oratory, right above the lipsena of the saint. The liturgy for February 7th, the feast of the saint, introduces the framework of the feast of the Hippapanti, the entry of Christ in the temple. For instance, the Troparion is a Troparion that is read in Hagia Sophia. I'm sorry, that is read in Hosios Loukas. Hail, full of grace, Theotoke pertene, for you are the Son of Justice that arises, Christ our Lord, irradiating those in darkness. Rejoice, all of you. So this Troparion that is read on the feast of Hosios Loukas is part and parcel of the Hippapanti celebrated in the space, and draws the parallels between Hosios Loukas, who receives in his arms Christ, and therefore it's both a mirror of the Virgin as well as the mirror of Simeon. And again, from the liturgy, you could see the quotes that are from the framework of the liturgy of the Hippapanti, building up the identity of Hosios Loukas. So Hosios Loukas is what we see here, interconnected with the feast of the Hippapanti. But there is another idea, and that is a victory. A kontakion, also for February 7th, that survives in several manuscripts and it's recorded in the modern service, draws the connection between Hosios Loukas and Mary as hypermachos stratego, because the music for this, as you can see here, the music for this kontakion is that of the famous Akathistos hymn. The connections are also brought up with the notion of duchion, to pneumatu, and the overall melodic structure, which I don't have the time and I'm not going to play for you. And as I conclude, I would like to draw how this idea of victory that comes with the Akathistos hymn and the particular Hodegitria type is invested in Hosios Loukas. Very briefly, the Akathistos has its pocket already in the liturgy recorded for in the 10th century Typicon of Constantinople, and it is celebrated at the Paramuni of Saturday in the Vlaherne. There is another feast of, and I'll finish here with two sentences. There is another feast that is celebrated to commemorate on August 16 the great victory over the Arabs in 717, with a procession from Hagia Sophia to the Golden Gates, where they sing the Virgin as the unbreakable fortress and the gate. Who are the emperors who promote these cults? These are the usurper strategy of the Byzantine army, Phokas and Tsimiskis, and they also promote Mary on their coins. But when it comes to the Hodegitria type, the Byzantine evidence comes from the 11th century, and the memory of the Hodegitria becomes associated with all the sieges in the two texts of the late 10th, early 11th century, the Triodion and the Diegesis of Elimos. But the evidence comes really from the satellites of Byzantium, where the 10th century evidence shows how the Hodegitria type becomes what Byzantium exports to its generals, because Bardas Phokas, possibly Jordan, Tsimiskis, Armenian. So these are the people who lead the Byzantine army. And the images of the Hodegitria appear on this elite art, like David the Koropalatis of Tao. So the entire space is the space that celebrates Marian victory. And with it, what we see is the mirror of Constantinopolitan great processions in the city and the rise of the empire against its enemies in the east and the conquest of that east. So I'll stop here and I'll be happy to entertain questions.
Thank you very much for that extraordinarily rich presentation. These conferences have tended to become more and more interdisciplinary, and what you've just presented to us shows how that can bear fruit. Most of us are musicians, and as we begin to realize the way in which music interacts with the other arts in liturgy, in architecture, in the whole setting for liturgical action, we learn more and more. Could I just ask you to, I think many people here will not know the word kalichoros. Could you just define that? Would you mind just defining that for people who do not know the term?
Sure. It is a Byzantine term, and it appears in the ekphrasis of Hagia Sophia, especially Paul the Silentiary, and it in its root is choros, this circular motility that shows what the creation is continuously moving and continuously producing a sound, the musica mundana, that is inaudible to humanity. But it is this power to which humanity tries to attune itself. And so it puts at the center the notion of a circle. The word is of archaic Greek origins, and it identifies both the place of action as well as the action itself, dance and chant, and it is the circumambulation of the altar. And so this term translates into Christianity. It loses some of its dance aspect, but it amplifies the chant aspect to it. So it is such a capacious term that puts in shadow our modern use of terms like nave or naos. So it really gives, and kalichoros, it's the beautiful choros. And basically, Paul the Silenciary insists on the beauty of Hagia Sophia and the fact that the central space is this stage that the faithful surround as they perform the dance and chant through which they could become attuned with the divine and therefore renewed.
Well, that's, I think, a provocative thought just in itself. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Let me just check on the YouTube channel. No. Does anyone have any questions or observations? Tell me it isn't so. There must be questions. I have to say, since nobody's asking anything, I have to say, if you've been to Hosios Loukas, as I have, what you discussed here gives a whole new dimension to it. I mean, I was totally unaware of those different layers, architectural and iconographical layers, and certainly of the signification of many of them. And you say, I think you said that there's not been a proper discussion of the iconographical scheme in Hosios Loukas until now.
Correct. And so I'll take the license in a sense, as having privileges to share screen, and as we are waiting for the audience either to I would like to play some music for you. And so we didn't have the time during the presentation. If you don't mind, Father Moody, can I play?
Of course.
Very well. So what I would like to play for you is the Kontakion for Hosios Loukas, because it really nails down the idea of victory, because it carries with it the association between Mary's powers as Strategos and Hosios Loukas. So parallels that are there with the Hippopanti, and the Hippopanti itself is a procession that develops exactly in this period in Constantinople, because the Kokoupratia Church, which is the host of this feast, does quite a lot to amplify its significance in Constantinople. And what we hear in the 10th century is the procession that starts at the Kokoupratia and progresses through the Vlaherne on the Hippopanti. So, but what I want to show you is this other aspect of victory. And so here are the two Kontakia, the established one with the Hypermachus Stratego ta Nikitiria, because this one in particular is associated with the victories, the victory over the Arabs, the Avars in 626. And so supposedly the Patriarch Sergius writes this second proemion, and it is to the music of the second proemion. And I'll I'll play for you Capella Romana singing. It's from an earlier album. This was when they performed in the Metropolitan Museum for the exhibition The Glory of Byzantine. And it comes from a 14th century manuscript, the music, but it's very similar to some of the other witnesses we have for the melodic structure. Mode 4, Lego. will not play the entire hymn, but what I wanted you to recognize is that, first of all, this akathistos would have been sung inside and outside. It will be part of the procession. So, and there are elements that are sung within the reverberant spaces. And so within the reverberant spaces, you have the lining up of these words, nikitiria, evcharisteria, theotoke, aprosmachiton, and so on and so forth. These are the moments, first of all, you have a leap of a fourth that is performed here, and then you have the reaching of the final of this mode, plagal 4, and therefore all the brightness, in a sense, focuses on this notion of victory, nikitiria, evcharisteria, and so on and so forth. And it is because it is powerful and long, it had been invested in the memory of eternal victory in Byzantium. And it's these ideas to which Hosios Loukas then becomes inserted. So I'll stop sharing here, but I had the chance, in a sense, to play the music for you. And now I have the morning sun rising very strongly into my space, and so washing out my face.
Well, thank you very much. It reminds me of the light of Hagia Sophia, of course,